Um, so thank you all for joining us tonight for our second monthly Davenant Fellows lecture. We created this lecture series to enable our Davenant teaching fellows to share with the general public a little sample of some of the topics that they're teaching in our Davenant Hall online courses and in other places. Last month we had visiting fellow Dr. Matthew Hoskins speak on Christmas and the Cross, celebrating the mystery of the Trinity on the Feast of the Nativity. The recording of this lecture is available on our YouTube channel. Tonight's speaker is Davenant teaching fellow Dr. Joseph Minich, who will be speaking on C.S. Lewis as Sage of Modernity, the Rhetoric of Miracles. Dr. Minich has been with the Davenant Institute in some capacity since very early on in our existence. He was the founding editor of our magazine Ad Fontes and served for a year as editor-in-chief of the Davenant Press before joining our teaching fellows team last January. Since then, he has taught several courses for Davenant Hall, hosted the Pilgrim Faith podcast, and lectured and written extensively. He is also the author of Enduring Divine Absence, The Challenge of Modern Atheism, published by the Davenant Press in 2018. So here in just a minute, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Minich. The lecture will be about 45 minutes, and then we're going to pause for a brief period for people to ask any questions that they might have. There is a specific feature in this called Q&A. You can find it at the bottom of your screens, and we would ask people to submit the questions through there and not through the chat. Although if you do submit through the chat, we'll be occasionally checking to see if there's any unanswered questions there, but primarily please submit questions through the Q&A function. And so after a brief pause, there'll be about 30 minutes of question and answer time. So with that being said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Minich.
All right, I appreciate the virtual applause. My good friends, I'm grateful to each of you for joining me this evening. I'm honored that of all the available sites of undoubtedly much needed catharsis available to you, you elected for this one. I'm confident that I can reward your faith in me with being non-dull, and on a day like today, maybe that is reward enough. But I also hope to offer a perspective on things that, if I don't fully persuade you, will at least play the role of catalyst for your own more mature reflections. But isn't this supposed to be about C.S. Lewis, you might ask? Indeed it is. But more specifically, what I'm attempting here is a sort of synoptic reading of what Lewis' project is. Is there a way that we can capture why and how Lewis had the broad and wide purchase that he had on 20th century Christianity? That he did so is indisputable, and how he did so, though, is subject to interpretation. This lecture is an at least partial interpretation of an answer to that question. And while the biography of Lewis is crucial to answering such a question more fully, it is nevertheless the case that most Christians' access to Lewis is through his writing. And what I want to do here is think of Lewis chiefly as a rhetorician, as a strategic communicator. What is Lewis doing and why in his characteristic style? I'll argue that the what and the why are bound up with one another in Lewis, and then I'll ask what it might look like to take the mantle of our elder brother today. I started to develop this reading of Lewis when I did a YouTube series on Lewis' book Miracles this summer for a nascent version of what sort of morphed into Davenant Hall. Having to summarize the text over 15 videos or so and try to show the relevance of each section for our own context involved paying a lot of attention to Lewis' argumentative strategies. Over the few months that I did this, it became clear to me that Lewis was a deceptively complex communicator. Deceptive because he comes off like a very straightforward one. And he is, but he is also doing much more to the reader than meets the eye. That is, he's doing much more than offering arguments, but rather offering arguments in a very particular way. And what I want to do this evening then is threefold. First, I'll cover 5 or so fascinating rhetorical moves that you can find in Miracles as kind of representative of Lewis' style, and contrast them to much of our own common attempts at persuasion. Then secondly, I'll ask what ties all of these moves together. What, in other words, do they add up to? I'll argue that they add up to a distinctive Lewisian reading of modernity and the church's task within it. Finally, we'll sit at our jolly friend's feet for a moment and consider how this might shape us today. So one, what is Lewis' rhetorical strategy? Two, why did Lewis take that strategy? And then three, how can this help us in our moment? First, then, Lewis' rhetorical strategy. I want to give 5 examples of Lewisian tactics here. So jumping right into that, number 1. This example is more general than the others, but notice the title of the book's 2nd chapter. The title of the 2nd chapter in Miracles is The Naturalist and the Supernaturalist. I think a lot of people writing this book would have been tempted to title the chapter Naturalism and Supernaturalism. But Lewis is always talking to persons, the naturalist and the supernaturalist. That is to say, Lewis does not treat ideas as floating free from actual human beings, inflected through all the complex motivations and intellectual gestures that make up a human life. This helps us to see why Lewis is typically not interested in refuting every possible counter-argument to whatever he's arguing, because his ultimate goal is not finally merely to win an argument, but rather to win a person. And so both his content and his strategy are shaped by this simple attunement. And when you move through the argument in Miracles, he's constantly relating to the reading audience as persons with like struggles and motivations as himself. And so his various brilliant asides are determined by realizing what animates persons who have the intellectual reactions that they do, and speaking to that rather than merely trying to kind of win the argument. And of course, the latter is crucial. Indeed, the central point of the book is to win an argument of sorts. But for Lewis, the winning of the formal argument must be ultimately and ordered toward winning a person. And so his rhetorical approach to his audience is always wider than the formal argument itself. And in this, Lewis realizes that formal arguments do not occur in a vacuum, but in the context of values and concerns and worries. And I think we intuitively grasp that this is the right approach to people, but we all struggle, I would argue, with this. One of the underexplored dimensions of our modern situation, and I'll be teaching a course on interpreting modernity next semester for Davenant Hall for any who might be interested. But one of the underexplored dimensions of our modern situation is how the various motions of our world attune us to tacitly code people as objects or as things. We tend to treat people like machines and approach them technically. So all problems are technical, and so are all solutions. It is our habit to read people, for instance, as kind of collections of ideas. And this is true on the right and the left, by the way. We see a person as a kind of walking philosophical system, and then read their whole personality through whatever the formal implication of that system is in our judgment. You know, Democrats are calloused about babies and Republicans don't care about poor people. You've all heard all that on Facebook. People are worldviews and sneakers, as one of my pals puts it. And so our approach to people is simply to refute the ideas of someone who is projected to be kind of fully possessed and sinister. What Lewis saw is that people, and especially himself, were bundles of contradiction, varying shades of understanding, nascent in their grasping after the light, infantile in their motivations and judgments, whether woke or red pill, even and sometimes especially when educated and trying to integrate all the latest hot takes. The enduring power of Lewis is captured in the subtlety of that chapter title. Lewis was after persons rather than arguments alone. And there's one more point worth saying about this, because it's a crucial point. Jordan Peterson makes this interesting comment that you can tell someone is being ideological when they simply regurgitate bullet points. Real people, he's a therapist, real people, when you talk to them, when they're really being real, are actually quite interesting. They're all different and they have different thoughts. They don't all understand things in precisely the same fashion. And in this sense, it's worth noting that Lewis is also being a full person in his writing. His formal structure, his outlines, his arguments, his examples, and his asides are all creative and very non-predictable. And this subtly gives the impression that he is not merely a very skilled tactician, sort of a 1950s Ben Shapiro apologist, but a more living person. And I think this has everything to do with his attraction. Right? And we see this cashed out in a lot of ways. So I'll move on to two here. Two, Lewis treats his, two of the five rhetorical points, that is. Two, Lewis treats his opponents with total fairness. Consider this extended passage. Here Lewis is summarizing the tension that some naturalists feel when considering Christian claims. Lewis writes, quote, "Everything seems to presuppose a conception of reality which the increase of our knowledge has been steadily refuting for the last 2,000 years, and which no honest man in his senses could return to today. It is this impression which explains the contempt and even disgust felt by many people for the writings of modern Christians. When once a man is convinced that Christianity in general implies a local heaven, a flat earth, and a God who can have children, he naturally listens with impatience to our solutions of particular difficulties and our defense against particular objections. The more ingenious we are in such solutions and defenses, the more perverse we seem to him. Of course, he says, once the doctrines are there, clever people can invent clever arguments to defend them, just as when once a historian made a blunder, he can go on inventing more and more elaborate theories to make it appear that it was not a blunder. But the real point is that none of these elaborate theories would have been thought of if he had read his document correctly in the first instance. In the same way, is it not clear that Christian theology would never have come into existence at all if the writers of the New Testament had the slightest knowledge of what the real universe is actually like?" Thus, Lewis continues, "At any rate, I used to think myself. The very man who taught me to think, a hard satirical atheist, an ex-Presbyterian, who doted on the golden bough and filled his house with the products of the Rational Press Association, thought in the same way. And he was a man as honest as the daylight, to whom I here willingly acknowledge an immense debt. His attitude to Christianity was for me the starting point of adult thinking. You may say it was bred in my bones, and yet since those days I have come to regard this attitude as a total misunderstanding. Remembering as I do from within the attitude of the impatient skeptic, I realize very well how he is forearmed against anything I may say for the rest of this chapter. I know exactly what this man is going to do." And Lewis goes on from there, end quote. So what's Lewis doing here? To put it plainly, he's not treating the reactions of others to Christianity as entirely sinister, but rather frequently rooted in a certain kind of ignorance. Note that he sees his friend as honest. Note that the skeptical response is described in an affirming way as natural. Naturally, they respond this way. Note also that he assumes that his enemies are in some way animated by virtue. They care about honesty, and they had virtue to share with the young Lewis, who learned adult thinking, he claims, from one of these persons. Now, it's obviously the case that there are often sinister motivations behind, people's rejection of certain claims, including in ourselves. But what Lewis understood is that persons aren't demons. That is to say, it is quite rare for an ordinary human being to be entirely lacking in some virtue, even in their own error. You can look at the character trajectory of Uncle Andrew in The Magician's Nephew if you want to see an interesting example of that. For the skeptic to be redeemed, as Lewis was, is not to abandon the adult thinking of the skeptic, but rather to move through that adult thinking into the wisdom of the elder, the old sage that Lewis became. I'd claim that we easily, us, by contrast, often have an instinct to describe the most banal motivations to our interlocutors. Of course they don't want a God. They just want to do what they want to do. And sure, maybe it is that simple sometimes, it is, but sometimes it's not. And we need to have a heart open to see when it's not, because the goal ought to be, after all, winning sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. And that means working with and seeing people's virtues, what God has given them to give to you, and which you must humbly receive from them. And in Lewis's case from the skeptics, adult thinking. 3, Lewis identifies himself with his audience. Note already how he identified the struggle of the skeptic as his own. In a lot of apologetics rhetoric, there's a kind of implicit sort of comma as opposed to those guys appended to the end of our claims. We're on the side of the facts, comma as opposed to those guys. We care about justice, comma as opposed to those guys. Note that Lewis almost always owns, if you read his corpus, and especially this book, Lewis almost always owns whatever error he is talking about as his own. And this includes especially his status as a modern person. The first sentence of this book, in fact, is, quote, "In all of my life, I have met only one person who claims to have seen a ghost." What's he doing there? In one sense, he's saying, I'm one of you guys. I'm not your kooky uncle. When I'm talking about miracles, I'm not, that guy down the street who sees all this weird stuff all the time. I'm as disenchanted as you in one particular way in terms of the kind of the experiences that I've had. Throughout the text, he highlights how the instinctive reactions of his audience are understandable, as well as his own instincts, because he has been shaped in a world very much like their own. In another section, he writes, quote, "The error which I am here trying to correct is one of the most sincere and respectable errors in the world. I have sympathy enough with it to feel shocked at the language I have been driven to use in stating the opposite view, which I believe to be the true one," end quote. Lewis treats himself as, in part, still in the position of the person who needs to be persuaded. He still feels the pull of a different view, simply because he's a man like any other, living at the same time as everyone else. But Lewis leads us to be surprised at reality. Hey, fellas, it's more than you thought, and all you hoped for as a child, which is no small part of his persuasive charm. 4. The ninth chapter of the book is titled A Chapter Not Strictly Necessary, and you can be sure that if Lewis titles a chapter something like that, it will be one of the most important chapters in the book. The chapter opens, quote, "The last 2 chapters have been concerned with objections to miracle made, so to speak, from the side of nature, made on the ground that she is the sort of system which could not admit miracles. Our next step, if we followed a strict order, would be to consider objections from the opposite side. In fact, to inquire whether what is beyond nature can reasonably be supposed to be the sort of thing that could or would work miracles. But I find myself strongly disposed to turn aside and face an objection of a different sort. It is a purely emotional one. Severer readers may skip this chapter. But I know it is one which weighed very heavily with me at a certain period of my life, and if others have passed through the same experience, they may care to read of it. One of the things that held me back from supernaturalism was a deep repugnance to the view of nature which, as I thought, supernaturalism entailed," end quote. Lewis goes on to describe a sort of aesthetic objection to supernaturalism rooted in worries that it destroys sort of the wildness of the wild and turns all of the outdoors into a large, boring moral tale. But what is he signaling here? Characteristic Lewis, he's actually caring about what his readers might care about. Even if he has already won the argument, and he has by this point in a substantive way, he also wants to prevent misunderstanding that might arise from a certain kind of unintegrated care structure, if we might put it that way, in his opponents. And I think, again, we have tendencies to be rather unlike this. One does not get the impression, when you scrolling through your Facebook feed, that your typical lefty friend, for instance, ever signals care about the concerns of those on the right. Does the longing for a connection to land, for intimate local communities that have a robust common project and exist in overlapping networks of trust, does that have real legitimacy? Do they see the impact of their vision on the household? And is the love of the household rooted merely in some sinister atavist drive, or is it possible that there are real goods that are being delighted in and protected? On the other hand, do people on the right signal to their counterparts that they care about what others care about? How actually curious am I to really understand why so many people think various things about our culture are unjust? And there's a simpler way to state all of this. In the real world, what reason do others have to trust us? What reason do others have to really trust that you or I have their interest at stake? that you come to the social negotiation table in good faith and for them as well as for yourself. This is not simply the same as the second point, that Lewis saw virtues and did not project demons into his neighbor. Rather, the point here is that he also actively sought to project care about the kind of concern behind any concern, you might say. He always sought to find whatever it was in his reader that was agitated or needed scratched, and which was ordinarily scratched with a bad idea, and then scratch it with a good one. Still, another way of saying this is that Lewis took people very, very seriously. And I think it's worth pondering what the cost of such a rhetorical approach is. You have to have a heart that is burning for people. And to be about winning them requires seeing them, having goodwill toward them, being patient, believing and hoping all things concerning them, etc. Moreover, it requires putting that first foot forward. And even that first foot requires an uncalloused heart that is not primarily waiting for, but rather actively extending goodwill, echoing, cultivating, and continuing the relational dynamic of love that the living Christ has, does, and will gift to our race through his Spirit. 5. I think it is fascinating to see how Lewis ends his book. He sets it up this way, quote, and yet, it is that and yet which I fear more than any positive argument against miracles. That soft tidal return of your habitual outlook as you close the book and the familiar four walls around you and the familiar noises from the street reassert themselves. Perhaps, if I dare suppose so much, you've been led on at times while you were reading, have felt ancient hopes and fears astir in your heart, have perhaps come almost to the threshold of relief, but now, no, it just won't do. Here is the ordinary, here is the real world round you again. The dream is ending, as all other similar dreams have always ended. For of course, this is not the first time such a thing has happened. More than once in your life before this, you've heard a strange story, read some odd book, seen something queer, or imagined you'd seen it, entertained some wild hope or terror, but always it ended in the same way. And always you wondered how you could, even for a moment, have expected it not to. For that real world, when you come back to it, is so unanswerable. Of course the strange story was false. Of course the voice was really subjective. Of course the apparent portent was a coincidence. You're ashamed of yourself for having ever thought otherwise. Ashamed, relieved, amused, disappointed, and angry all at once, end quote. And then Lewis goes on to talk about how reason in our context with people like ours, with imaginations and mental habits like ours, have to rehabituate themselves. It's a process to become more fully and deeply persuaded. In any case, note what's going on here. All through the book, Lewis has gone to great lengths to make sure that persons might find something to persuade them in his writing. But here he goes a step further. He is fearful that his audience might be self-sabotaged through the habituation of their materialist mental habits. And before he closes the book, he pursues them even to this last point, casting one more rhetorical barb. He pursues the reader, as it were, out of the pages into that moment after the book is closed. And what I want us to see in this is that the heart of Lewis actually burns for his neighbor. He is deeply invested. He comes off as deeply invested in his neighbor's good. Or said differently, Lewis is not simply interested in sort of doing the act of evangelism, having a sort of scalp belt for the amount of times he truth spoke, but rather he's interested in the objects of evangelism. And this directly shapes his approach to them. He's desperate to do whatever he can, as we will see further below, to not leave any behind. And I wonder how much our own speech, by contrast, is mostly about ourselves. How invested, you might ask, are we in our encounters with others? Social media especially tempts us as modern people to trivialize human exchanges, treating drive-by utterances as though they have intrinsically prophetic weight. Lewis, you might say, pursued people rhetorically, going far beyond the gotcha style of rhetoric to win his neighbor. I'm going to take a sip of water here real quick. All right, so far so good. Lewis is trying to win people even as he wins arguments. Lewis is fair and he affirms his opponent's virtues. Lewis takes pain to identify himself with the embarrassing flaws, reactions, and questions of his audience. Lewis shows concern for what his opponents care about, and Lewis pursues his reader directly as far as he is able, and all while making a philosophically brilliant argument about miracles. You can see a symmetry here between what makes Lewis' arguments so helpful and the personal aura with which he surrounds them. The whole corpus of Lewis is an attempt to kind of bring the wealth of the tradition, if you will, into the hands of common persons. But he does not separate bringing a set of content to a particular audience and gaining personal credibility with that audience. In fact, he himself attempts to be attractive while persuading others of a vision he has come. He thinks some piece of them actually desires to be real because of its intrinsic attractiveness. Just because Christianity for Lewis just does fulfill human nature, and Christ really is the desire of the nations. So you might think of Lewis' work as an act of coming near in both mind and affect. A lay elder brother talking to the rest of us about life, and even open at the end of the book, no less, to correction. He writes, quote, "If I'm wrong, then the sooner I am refuted, the better, not only for you, but for me," end quote. In any case, I want to spend a few moments discussing a certain angle that might help give a larger reading of his rhetorical question, or his rhetorical posture. If I could put it this way, what game did Lewis think he was playing in his rhetoric? Helping us see this might help make sense of his strategy, and then, as I'll take up in the conclusion, I'll also help us think about how it might shape ours today. So turning to our second subject, though, we've already talked, what was Lewis' rhetorical strategy? What were some of the peculiar things he's doing? So our second subject, why did he take this strategy? How is he reading these rhetorical tactics relative to his own historical moment? We get a hint of his answer in the following passage. Here, Lewis is trying to explain how unbelief in our era has become plausible over the last several centuries. So this is an extended quote. He writes, quote, "Since the 16th century, when science was born, the minds of men have been increasingly turned outward to know nature and to master her. They have been increasingly engaged on those specialized inquiries for which truncated thought is the correct method. It is therefore not in the least astonishing that they should have forgotten the evidence for the supernatural. The deeply ingrained habit of truncated thought, what we have called the scientific habit of mind, was indeed certain to lead to naturalism, unless this tendency were continually corrected from some other source. But no other source was at hand, for during the same period, men of science were coming to be metaphysically and theologically uneducated," end quote. So what's Lewis getting at here in this portion of the quote? I'm going to go to a little more later. But so far, he's arguing that the kind of mental habits that we have inherited are extremely useful for accomplishing certain things, science and technology. But those kind of postures, those mental postures, the way in which that kind of attunement carves up the world has always required correction from another set of concerns and mental habits and thoughts. However, at the same time as kind of the catalyst for one set of mental habits was climbing, the cultivation of that other set of insights was slowly declining. And so on into our own time. So basically, Lewis is just talking about the secularization of culture at the level of ordinary life, culture, and institutions. So we have this situation where it's easy to forget what was once obvious to some of our ancestors because we're attuned to the world in very distinctive and peculiar ways. But then Lewis goes on, quote, "The state of affairs in which ordinary people can discover the supernatural only by abstruse reasoning is recent, and by historical standards abnormal. All over the world until quite modern times, the direct insight of the mystics and the reasonings of philosophers percolated to the mass of the people by authority and tradition. They could be received by those who were no great reasoners themselves in the concrete form of myth and ritual and the whole pattern of life. In the conditions produced by a century or so of naturalism, plain men are being forced to bear burdens which plain men were never expected to bear before. We must get the truth for ourselves or go without it. There may be two explanations for this. It might be that humanity, in rebelling against tradition and authority, has made a ghastly mistake, a mistake which not be the less fatal because the corruptions of those in authority rendered it very excusable. On the other hand, it may be that the power which rules our species is at this moment carrying out a daring experiment. Could it be intended that the whole mass of the people should now move forward and occupy for themselves those heights which were once reserved only for the sages? Is the distinction between wise and simple to disappear because all are now expected to become wise? If so, our present blunderings would be but growing pains. But let us make no mistake about our necessities. If we are content to go back and become humble plain men obeying a tradition, well. If we are ready to climb and struggle on till we become sages ourselves, better still. But the man who will neither obey wisdom in others nor adventure for her or himself is fatal. A society where the simple many obey the few seers can live. A society where all were seers could live even more fully. But a society where the mass is still simple and the seers are no longer attended to can achieve only superficiality, baseness, ugliness, and in the end extinction. On or back we must go. To stay here is death, end quote. What's Lewis arguing here? He's arguing that perhaps we should view our current cultural moment from the vantage point of what it may be. Clearly, the kinds of knowledge we've achieved for the last 500 years is useful and important. And while it is true that it was developed alongside trends that have evaporated the channels through which wisdom is classically threaded together, the sages and ordinary people, perhaps this is precisely in the name of requiring that ordinary people mature in a unique way. If it takes the wisdom of sages to govern civilization, perhaps we have been given a circumstance wherein we simply must mature or die. And I think it would be interesting to look at Lewis as an attempted mediator in his circumstance, interpreting it precisely that way. Could it be argued that Lewis' efforts are precisely toward cultivating a civilization of sages? That is to say, Lewis realizes that the future of the church and the plausibility of the faith in a modern civilization requires a much thicker distribution and internalization of wisdom among the masses. And this is not in tension, it's crucial to note, with the old hierarchies and channels, but rather works alongside them. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. In any case, one might see Lewis as absorbing as much of the kind of philosophical, literary, and theological tradition as he could, and then internalizing and sort of synoptically representing it to ordinary people, precisely so that they could come into contact with wisdom, not in the form of a ritual or some authority to which I have to respond in a kind of political context, but rather as a good that I wish to possess, a thing that I might want to know in some substantive way, because this jolly pal told me to think about it. It seems to me that this makes enormous sense out of Lewis' project. He's precisely a modern kind of mediator, a layman who knows how to write books, capturing as wide an audience as he can, running after them so that as many persons as possible might, in their various walks of life, consider Christ in the wisdom of the Christian tradition. In this light, it's crucial to note that Lewis, as I've mentioned already, treats himself as a modern person with modern mental habits and instincts. And indeed, it's precisely by attuning himself to the beauty of the Christian tradition from within that headspace that he became such an effective communicator to his fellows, who are not judged for all their peculiarities then, because Lewis, again, thinks of himself as one of them, and precisely in that is he able to help them. He knows he needs the very same aid that he's giving to everybody else. It seems plausible to me that this also helps us understand the rhetorical strategies that I described above. Not only is Lewis sort of rhetorically pursuing his neighbor, but he's doing so as part of the human civilizational project. Modern people are atrophied in their imagination. Lewis, in fact, says that he went to writing Narnia after all these apologetics books because he realized, in fact, that you need to target the imagination. And it's precisely this kind of lack of imagination that Lewis is seeking to remedy. As he says in the Weight of Glory, there's a fun line. Lewis says, quote, "Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am," end quote. Lewis is quite literally playing the role of wizard in his writing. It is not that the world is disenchanted, as we often speak. It's rather that human beings, that we, us, our souls are disenchanted. And one reading of Lewis is he's attempting to sort of summon us awake, not only as individuals, but with an eye to civilization as well. One can see in both Lewis' fiction and his nonfiction works that he's very much concerned with the project of civilization. What's remarkable is that he apparently thought that this rhetorical strategy was the way to help it along. And it would seem he was correct. You know, who has achieved a wider reach than Lewis in the last century? What would have been different about the last century among Christians without him? Perhaps he was tapped into something that we should seek to discern. So we have just a little bit of time left. I'm going to take one more sip of water here, and we'll get to part 3 of the lecture. And so in the third portion of the lecture here, I just want to say a few words about what we might have to gain from Lewis today. And here I'm speaking for myself. Maybe Lewis will roll in his grave. I don't think so, but this is more for me, I suppose. How does this help us in our situation? Well, 60 years after Miracles was published, it seems clear that civilization is definitely not moving back toward deference to tradition. This does not mean that deference toward tradition is not achievable, but it is precisely that, an achievement in our context. It's no longer a given. And as such, it would seem that we should consider Lewis' other option. Is it possible that our calling as a civilization and as Christians within it is to reach a certain kind of maturity in a more widely distributed way? And is it possible to read all of our current agitations as potentially growing pains or labor pains rather than heralds of death? Or minimally, perhaps we can do what we can to make this the story, as midwives seek to preserve the lives of women in the moments of high-risk labor. That is, they want the birth story to end with a mother who had a scary moment, but it survives, right? It seems to me that Lewis, and one could say this of Bavinck before Lewis as well, James Eglinton's recent biography of Bavinck really gets at this. In any case, Lewis detected that there are unique civilizational goods generated in the modern order. Nevertheless, he saw that this rearrangement of civilization had its risks and costs. The risk of abandoning all that was formerly reinforced by authority, a lot of good things, and the cost of having to achieve the good precisely by freely internalizing it, to really risk failing to achieve it. Just as a kid kicked out of the home, right? You leave your mom and dad's house, and your options are either to grow up and make a life for yourself, or to fail in some way. I'll pass on there. Maybe we'll talk about that in the comments. Anyway, in a way, Bavinck and Lewis see modern culture as in an enormously complex process of renegotiation. You might say that modern culture is this circumstance where all the traditional ways in which authority and subject and parent and child and husband and wife and men and women and clergy and laity, all of those structures are in a period of deep renegotiation, just lived factual renegotiation. Whether you like the fact that it's a renegotiation or not, it's just happening. And it's not that the natural law norms ever cease to apply, or that the good changes in its substance, but rather it is the case that a rapidly changing circumstance will also require wisdom in order to discern how to apply those norms to just right here, right now. Inasmuch as tradition mediates a sort of instinct, much of our cultural instinct, much of the instinct that it mediates, even though it's good and has wisdom in it oftentimes, nevertheless arose in a context that's very different from ours. And this is precisely why instinct and custom and all those sorts of things are very much in the process of rapidly changing from one generation to the next right now. And this brings with it both the dangers of a kind of radicalism, let's get rid of all tradition, or of a reactionary balkanism, let's just hold on to tradition just because it's tradition. And wisdom really, I think Lewis and Bavinck help us to see, looks like neither of those paths. In any case, I want to think about our current moment through this lens. I think we're all aware that we live in a time where no matter which side of the culture or religious wars you're on, there's a massive breakdown of trust in public and common institutions, and there's an enormous breakdown of trust in one another, especially. And this is not disconnected from the evaporation of local communities, because trust ultimately is a highly intimate affair. One of the things I'll talk about in my class is Anthony Giddens' book, The Consequences of Modernity. And he interprets modernity very much through the lens of trust, where trust ceases to be a local thing and becomes this increasingly outsourced spectral thing. So we learn to trust systems and experts and things like this. In the absence, however, of thick, overlapping, and embodied networks of trust, it is not surprising that Westerners, and especially Americans, bond with one another in more spectral ways, such as common interests and what has taken on increased prominence in our time, common ideas, common ideological themes. The little tribalist Neanderthal living in all of us, you might say, long since removed from an obviously bounded village, now reinvents a virtual tribe of fellow true believers. And I think especially we conservatives, and I consider myself a conservative, need to be profoundly cautious about the unique degree to which ideology is a temptation in our age. We're an anxious and fractured people living in confusing times. And that's not just a platitude. It really is confusing to be alive right now. Very few people don't actually, even if they say that it's all simple, if you just think about it, very few people actually don't feel some degree of destabilization. And that's because it really is complicated and overwhelming out there in some ways. And saying otherwise, it seems to me, is just wrong. And to the extent that we simply seize certainty by an act of will, even if that takes the form of adopting a particular intellectual system, we inevitably, despite all the goods we might otherwise possess, place, or at least risk, placing something in the driver's seat that might turn us into demons, or might tend to turn us into demons, as I would argue being ideological inevitably does. In our case, it seems to me that our perennial temptation is to read one another not as people with complex motivations and thoughts and stories, but rather as totems of a system. And when we do this, when we reduce a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve to their tweets, we must see that doing this functions in a particular way for us. And I learned this kind of language from my good friend Jim. Doing this functions in a particular way for us. We, as it turns out, need, if you really, I think when we pair this apart and look at it and say, what's really going on here? I don't think it's too much to say that we need, it turns out, this foil for ourselves. We need that foil, which is why we do it. And so we instrumentalize our neighbor psychologically to achieve some kind of catharsis. You know, I'm not one of those guys. I'm on this team that's, you know, with the good. And I think the rhetorical approach of Lewis to others when he's trying to persuade them of something really exposes us here. What if we, like he, took others with total gravity? Most of you have heard this famous quote from The Abolition of Man, but it's kind of a long quote again, but it's worth reiterating here, just to think about it's Inauguration Day. Think about this quote in our current context. Quote, "It may be possible for each of us to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too much or too often or too deeply of that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. I'll pause there for just a second. That's a fascinating comment. All day long, we're helping people either here or here. There's no neutral encounter with other human beings, Lewis is trying to say there. You're either helping shove them toward glory or toward becoming a demon. It is in this light, he goes on, it's in this light of these overwhelming possibilities. It is with the awe and circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play, but our merriment must be of that kind, and it is, in fact, the merriest kind, which exists between people who have from the outset taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be real and costly love with deep feeling for the sins, in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. Next to the beloved sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses, end quote. Do we hear that? The burden of my neighbor's glory, taking each other seriously. Brothers and sisters, on a day like today, I think our chief tragedy is precisely that we as a civilization have failed to do this. Certainly we talk a lot, certainly we argue a lot, but do we actually feel the burden of our neighbor's glory? Do we recall that persons are not demons, that ultimately we fight not against flesh and blood, we rather fight sin and the devil, and we fight for flesh and blood, actually. We fight for mankind himself. Do we see how much further we might go in reaching mankind, in reaching our neighbor, in reaching even our own civilization? Do we really see each other, or do we rather project on each other and remain abstractions? Do we understand what and why each other care about the things that we care about? Do we grasp why people have the moral instincts that they have, what context those were formed in? And absolutely crucially, do we see what and why people form trust? And do we fancy ourselves to have actually, in any realistic way, to have earned trust? Do all our arguments come with goodwill, care, and a burning burden that I leave my neighbor not alone, but that I humbly receive all that they have to offer me, whether it be the adult thinking of the skeptics or whatnot, even while offering what God has, I think, given me and us, to offer them. Here's Lewis' chief insight for us, I think. This approach just is part of the project of human civilization. And I think the failure of the church would precisely be to fail to live in hope and to give up on it. And I cannot help but think that the chief tragedy is that there's so much that the church has to offer that is left unoffered, light under a bushel rather than a temple of God's faithful presence in the darkness. Because behind all of the agitation, behind all of the tribal formations, behind all of the issues is a civilization, a nation, states, communities, families, and individuals in states of profound crisis. It is no accident that we live in an era of massive mental health problems, extreme hopelessness among young people, and the settlement for the low-hanging fruit of ideology or hedonism, rather than the true food of God's own rest. And yet it is us, my friends, the church, who has something to say to a world starving for the Father. All expressive individualists, all snowflakes, all shoved into the era of authenticity. We're all this stuff, all of us. We're all snowflakes. We're all expressive individualists. And our gig is up in some way. As it turns out, we're all a little bit of a mess, when you look under the covers, and can hardly help saying and showing so out loud. What we fail to see is that this might be a moment, precisely that exposure might be a moment of profound grace, because it is to the exposed and the agitated that the way of Christ is always shown the brightest. It's interesting that James Baldwin, who, if you know who he is, you know he's no conservative, he once said, quote, "I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain," end quote. It's precisely the church, though, who can train man in the art of mourning, a mourning that is blessed, that leads to life rather than to death. And precisely in that, Christ toppled an empire already through creating slaves who loved their masters, husbands who loved their wives, wives who honored their husbands, subjects who lived in their neighbor, and even sought to bless the dictator sometimes. As Tom Holland shows in his recent book, Dominion, we're still coming to grips with the civilizational implications of the moral vision of the New Testament. That's a fact of reality, folks. And it is perhaps fitting that we view our own moment in the story of man as something that can be framed in that light. We can whine, but we can also be adults, co-rulers with our fellows who will take up the project of civilization precisely by taking up the project of not leaving our neighbors alone, zealous for their glory, feeling the burden of their glory and their good. Perhaps we take up the project of civilization precisely by sitting with one another in their pain in order to minister the healing presence of Christ. Perhaps the conservative longing for home, that's a big motif, I think maybe the chief good that conservatives seek to preserve is sort of all that is attached associationally with the value of home, of place. But perhaps the conservative longing for home, for place, can be fulfilled by offering and cultivating a home to a homeless civilization, for providing place to placeless people. Let me make two caveats here before I shut up my yammerings. One, I don't think anything I've said is inconsistent with any particular project out there. There are a lot of particular projects at least. There's lots of tasks and lots of jobs, lots of strategies. Civilization's a big thing. And so I don't think what I've said I think what I've said, I should say, is consistent both with sort of your Moscow, Idaho-like project or a Tim Keller-like project in New York City. Each of these could be framed at least within the kind of the values I'm trying to describe here. At least I think they could. Whether they are is a different question. Two, I don't mean to suggest that all situations admit of Lewis' style of rhetoric. A real culture, certainly there are moments that have their Machiavellian elements in life. There are actually things like concrete political realities. There are times when one must fight to win in an approximate manner. Sometimes you just need the best meme. I get it. The point is nevertheless that most of our encounters are really just personal. People at institutions really can go talk to each other. People are in the halls of Congress really could try to get along. They used to get along better, actually. You could actually refuse to judge that person who said something annoying on Facebook. We could actually take on the project of really trying to understand a couple people who thought differently than us, and even wondering if they might have something to offer us. Don't ever forget that these people are all co-rulers. That's so crucial, I think. They're all co-rulers, images of God alongside us. And what I'm arguing, and I think Lewis is showing, what I'm arguing, lost my place. What I think Lewis is showing is that this is just the Christian default posture. We're an army of friends to the world. We bring a conquering love that is too jolly to leave you stewing over there in your anger. Christ is jealous through us to kick the devil out of you and restore the reign of mankind. Because you, my neighbor, my fellows, all of you are my brothers and sisters, fellow kings and queens, fellow sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, whom I would bless as I can, and as God has given me gifts to give to you, to bless you. I feel, thinking toward the neighbor, I feel the crushing burden of your glory In fact, that is the battle. That's the battle for civilization in some ways, even. It's the actual and most central fight. And I refuse to leave you, my neighbor whom I love, alone. Speaking for myself, brothers and sisters, I think it only takes a scroll of social media to make it clear to us that this is a matter of civilizational urgency for us in some ways. We really can't go on pretending that our ordinary reactions and ways of relating to one another are sustainable. We all tend toward the posture of the ideologue. We all tend to be snowflakes, if you will. And I speak to myself the most. But reading Lewis and Bavinck has helped to persuade me that there's a better way, a more compelling vision, and one that compromises nothing of our love for God's word or his world. Is it possible, dear friends, to look at each human face we encounter and say to ourselves, there goes a regal son of Adam or daughter of Eve? Maybe a new trans secretary of health, just to pick a random example. There goes a regal son of Adam or daughter of Eve. The common good, the collective rule is part theirs, and I feel my limits over against them. And yet I also believe that I have something to offer them. And I'm so jealous for the dignity of their reign that I will go give it to them, inasmuch as I'm able. And I will train my sons and daughters to be the sorts of people who go after their neighbor in this way with the love of Christ. Is it possible for the parish church to train its members to leave as an agent of Christ, Christ's whole personed friendship, presenting his truth in both speech and affect with our lives? I think Lewis thought so, and I don't think that being captivated by his vision could possibly leave us the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Minich, for that wonderful lecture. At this time, we can take a few minutes for anybody who has questions to go ahead and submit them using either the chat or the Q&A feature, preferably the Q&A feature. And then we'll take about 30 minutes to answer whatever is on the people's minds. See. And questions are pouring in.
All right.
So
hopefully answers will be pouring out. We'll see how it goes.
Let's see, we've got 4 of them.
All right.
So question 1, what is the road to disciplining ourselves into not only re-enchanting our worldview, but rehumanizing our intellectual and moral foes? Did Lewis ever attempt to explicitly catechize his strategy in other writings, or was his work mostly implicit? I like that question.
Can you repeat it? I just want to make sure I get all the details, because I got half of it, I think. I just want to make sure I get it all.
Sure, there's 2 questions here, I think.
Okay.
So what is the road to disciplining ourselves into not only re-enchanting our worldview, but rehumanizing our intellectual and moral foes? And then
okay.
The second portion of this, did Lewis ever attempt to explicitly catechize his strategy in other writings, or was his work mostly implicit?
Okay. Yeah, so there's a couple things to say there. Certainly, certainly part of, the language of disenchantment and re-enchantment can be used in all sorts of ways that I don't care for so much, which is why I like to speak of re-enchanting persons rather than the world. The world is just as fantastic as it ever was, but we're atrophied. And so I want to frame it that way. So how do we I think Lewis, in some ways, is directly doing that in his writing and in his stories. He's trying to captivate the imagination. He's not just writing a sort of systematic treatise with bullet points and arguments. He's trying to capture in vivid ways your imagination and its connections to sort of the vibrancy of reality. And so that's one thing. And nevertheless, like it's at the end of the book, he does talk about habituation. So at the end of the book, one of the things he says is, inasmuch as we're ordering ourselves according to reason, reason is only at its post when you're not asleep. Reason is only at its post when you're actually actively reason is, and he means reason broadly there. You could think of it as sort of ordering yourself according to reality. It's only at its close as much as you're consciously doing it, at least during the time when your habits have been sort of formed this way. And so until you're sort of rehabituated in a different direction, it's important for us, I think, for ourselves to be constantly reminded. And that might not have been true for some people in other contexts, but I think for modern people in our context, rereading things. So rereading things and rethinking and recapturing in our minds various claims and why and how they're true is really important for us to be kind of plugged into reality. And that can be habituated where it doesn't require that kind of thing. But two other things I'll say. The other things we could talk about are the Christian practices, of course. So, and this is where somebody like, James K.A. Smith is really useful. You are what you love. I have some quibbles with Jamie Smith and some of the ways he argues. Nevertheless, I think his argument is basically correct, that taking up the Christian practices kind of attunes the whole, including Christian community, Christian liturgy, private Christian practices such as prayer and all this sort of things, putting your body in a position to actually go through the motions of the Christian life sort of reattunes or helps, in accordance with what the mind perceives to be good, helps at least to reattune us to those things about reality which we confess to be true. But third, there's no substitute for just relating to other people. So one thing I would say is if, again, the most sacred thing next to you besides the sacrament, Lewis says, is your neighbor. If you want to really be re-enchanted, get to know somebody, really become a friend, really have a relationship that's meaningful and that has real bonds. And I think there's something that occurs in that space, in that relational dynamic, that helps attune us here, that helps us to see, see the full import of the fact of what a person is, an image of God, and it puts them in a context to give all that God has given them to give to us. And so I think in one way, the answer is actually cultivating a life of friendship. I think that's maybe one way I'd say it. So there's a couple of things there, but if I haven't quite scratched the itch, do make another comment, and I'll try and get back to it.
This second question, I think, flows rather nicely into it. Do you think it's possible to build trust in Lewis's way over social media?
Yes. Well, yes, I do think it's possible to build some kind of trust over social media, at least. Maybe that's relevant. So I was just talking with a Christian publisher today, and one of the things he was saying to me, and I thought it was an interesting point, was, a lot of people are talking about social media, you can't accomplish anything over social media, as though the internet's going away, and it's not. It's like the automobile, it's here. Like television, it's here. The internet and social media are here. It's where people communicate. And I actually think that it's hard, that the tendency of social media is very much toward, sort of the rhetoric of the mic drop and the gotcha, sort of the Ben Shapiro talking point thing. And so it's not easy to cultivate trust over social media. And there's some people who you're not going to cultivate trust over social media with. But there can be exceptions, and I guess largely I say that because I've seen it. I have actually seen real conversations happen on social media. It just takes people willing to have a real conversation, and it takes somebody. Often, what happens is everybody kind of comes into the social media space and they're all LARPing and giving their sort of their one-off aphorisms or whatever. And it takes somebody kind of entering the fray and actually inserting a different relational dynamic in there. Hey, I'm going to take all you seriously. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to jump all over you. But what about this question? And you sort of take a, hey, I'm just your pal. We're having a conversation here tone. And you kind of summon that out of people. Instead of like seeing, oh, you're acting a little bit like a demon there. Well, let me just make you even more of one. What I say is, you know what? I don't think you have to act that way, and I'm actually going to try and attract you to acting a different way. I think that's what Lewis would do if he had Facebook. You know, I can't speak for. I'll ask him when I get there.
So someone writes, regarding Lewis's engagement with his readers' cares and problems, too often I've observed Christians, presumably attempting to do this, ultimately watering down the difficult truths of the gospel. Does Lewis offer a particular strategy, not only for running after and engaging with one's neighbors as whole persons, but also for maintaining the integrity of the message that you're giving to them?
That is an excellent question. And I think this is the thing. It's precisely through this that Lewis is maintaining the integrity of the answer, because what he's doing, and maybe I should have put this more explicitly in the lecture, what he's doing is making you comfortable so that when he throws the truth right down the middle in his bullseye way, you trust him, you're comfortable with him, you know he has your good at stake, you know he cares about you, and then he says that very hard thing. And you can't dismiss it when he says it, because he's earned saying it and not being dismissed in all those ways that others can be dismissed. And that is a concern. There is a sort of a possibility that these kinds of rhetorical points be seen as sort of free-floating apart from actually speaking the truth. But I think what Lewis is actually doing is saying, I know that if I say this truth, these people are going to react in this way. And so what I want to do is kind of almost pre-evangelism in a way. I want to, as it were, kind of rhetorically, as I want to be as friendly. I want to become as good friends with my reader as I can through writing. And then I actually have earned the ability to be really precise with the gospel. And so that's the thing. When you actually read Lewis, he's doing all of this. And yet he's not actually compromising the truth. He does talk about the hard things. He does actually speak very, very boldly all the time. But he's doing that not because like, I have to be the truth teller. You know, it's not about him. You know, he's not LARPing, you know, scripting himself into the role of sort of the prophet drive-by guy. You know, he's taking the speaking of those words actually so seriously. And I think actually that's part of what unites it. If I take this precious gospel and these precious truths that I've learned in the Christian faith, and I take communicating them seriously, like I want people, I feel the burden of my neighbor's glory, and I deeply want them to know this truth and to receive this truth. If he takes that posture, then it's really like there's not a compromise for him, I don't think. I have to do both of these things. I both have to speak the truth, and we might say in love, speak the truth in love. And the in love side of it is sort of perhaps guiding what I'm arguing are his rhetorical tactics. But I think those are deeply, deeply united. And in fact, one is more powerful precisely as it comes with the other.
I think that's very helpful. And so as Dr. Minich is answering these questions, if any of you have follow-up questions, we would invite you to keep putting them in the Q&A box, and we can keep going. We have another question. Is there anyone you would identify as something of a legitimate heir to Lewis in their apologetic approach today?
Yeah, I mean, in various ways, lots of people. It's only in my 30s that I really rediscovered Lewis, and 30. I'm appreciating him at this kind of whole new level than I did as a teenager, and I'm not, for speaking for myself, I'm not certain that there's anybody who's achieved quite what he has achieved in my judgment, which is fine. You know, that's not a problem. But nevertheless, I think there are people who take something of his approach. I could think of somebody like Os Guinness, I think I think people of all, well, I'll just say somebody like Os Guinness, perhaps. James Anderson, who's he's a presuppositionalist actually, but James Anderson wrote this wonderful article for the Gospel Coalition called "Can I Prove the Existence of God?" And what he argues in the article is the real question is, can I prove the existence of God to this person? And so he adds an angle like that into his kind of apologetic arsenal. And I'm sure, I wouldn't call him an apologist. He's a philosopher who's nevertheless thinking about kind of the truths of the tradition in a sort of open-ended exploratory way. Stephen R.L. Clark, so he's an English philosopher. I would consider him certainly this way, and of course, there's I hate to say actually part of this is that I don't read tons and tons of apologetics books. I can think of examples that are very unlike Lewis, but it would be unpolite to name them. But yeah, I'm trying to think. Guinness, and I could, if I were thinking hard, I could probably come up with others. But Clark, Os Guinness, I think those are the ones I'd stick with for now.
We have what looks to be a very rich and in-depth question in here, although I'm having difficulty deciphering it. So I'm going to turn on the gentleman's microphone and allow him to ask it, if that's all right with you.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Mr. Barlow, would you mind asking your question?
My good friend Byron.
Oh, well, thank you for that, because I think I was rambling here, and that's the problem. But
no worries. I love you, Byron. You can ramble all you want.
Oh, you're a sweet man with a great presentation. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.
I guess what I didn't want to do was put trigger words in, and I had trouble because it's such a huge concept. But I've increasingly believed that we're in a totally unique situation. So I think I was asking two questions.
All right.
But as you remind me of what our dear brother C.S. Lewis was fighting in Cambridge and elsewhere regarding modernity and other things, I guess I've been giving too much credence to that belief. Would you comment on that? In other words, today we do have a setup that seems almost complete, like a perfect storm for people to become the fat, lazy minds that Os Guinness talked about. I think of the Wall-E scene where the fat people are
right. Right.
But yeah, can you comment on that and how, not so much the uniqueness of it, but what you see as unique in our situation right now and how Lewis could help?
Yeah. There's a lot that could be said there. One thing I would say, Carl Trueman was asked a while ago, like, what's the most important moment? And he's a church historian. What's the most important moment in church history, or most impactful moment in church history? And his answer, I think without skipping a beat, was something like 1907, the invention of the Model T Ford. So part of what is unique about our situation, I think, and some of it was in the lecture, I think the context in which we form ordinary communal bonds is very different. So the impact of not just the automobile, but in an economy where mobility is much more prominent, an economy where to some extent there's some resistance to this, which is good, at least for the last several decades, where local communities have been declining, which has tended to be the context in which you have church life and these sorts of things, where all this sort of stuff is worked out. A lot of that's evaporating, and I think the architects of Silicon Valley see this as well. What we see, especially with the advent of the internet, is we see, especially with the advent of the internet, we see people increasingly becoming abstractions. They're not embodied anymore, and it's an epochally significant transition. There's the invention of writing, there's the invention of the printing press, and the internet is quite literally, a lot of technological historians already look at the internet as sort of printing press level significance. Well, what happened with the last printing press? Well, the Renaissance and the Reformation. Well, here we are with this, our new printing version of the printing press. And there's all sorts of problems. Like, we think of the internet, you start to think, well, good grief, online pornography, the pornography problem is just unspeakably rampant. What Lewis might say to that is, does that mean we actually have to become chaste now? Like, in the 1960s, if you wanted to go find the pornography, you had to get in the car and wear a hat and like hope you didn't see the local Baptist at the store. Now it's like, now it's all, now it's right there. It's so tempting. It's like being an alcoholic living in a liquor store where the whole world has become a liquor store. Well, now you really have to work on being an alcoholic, and now you really have to work toward what the virtue of chastity is. But the internet, just as it presents all those challenges, also presents, I'm aware of the fact that some pastors in Africa literally desire seminary education more than they desire, not more, at the same level as they desire increased access to food and water. I've heard missionaries bring these stories back, or people who were part of missions teams talk to local pastors. They want seminary education so bad because here they are pastors and they need help, sort of leading their congregation and refuting the error around them. But what the internet has made possible is now that there's wonderful seminary education available to pastors with nothing, as long as they can plug into the internet. And that's similar to, in a way, the way we could think of this is, what man means for good, what man means for evil, God can actually instrumentalize for good. And that's kind of the whole of redemptive history, right? My good friend Jim, who might still be here, I'm not sure, talks a lot about God redeeming your story. And it's sort of Rome was founded on hubris, but sure was good for spreading the gospel. Those roads were great for Paul. And then Christ instrumentalized through his death and resurrection the entirety of the Roman apparatus. And it seems to me that on the one hand, this era of the internet, we're all yelling at each other, we're fracturing apart as a nation, we're all ideologues, we might burn the thing down. But it might also be that moment where we actually really have to learn to get along, where we actually really have to learn what it is like to have friendship and to live with others that are complicated and have pain that we have to understand. So I think the kind of people that we have to be formed into are, they're more complex. We have to become more complex people in some ways, or have more complex communities and sets of values that I think are addressed to our situation. And it seems to me it's fitting. We don't know the future and we shouldn't be overly speculative, but it's fitting to imagine that perhaps God is up to something. Again, maybe that first Reformation was after the printing press. Maybe the internet will, the devil thought it would just get the porn out there all over the place, but it turns out God is going to make a second Reformation out of it. Well, we should pray toward that end at least. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
You graciously gave a chance for a follow-up. I didn't want to do the Benedict option trigger word because most people think, oh, you can't just pull away and
yeah.
Get rid of the public square like we've abandoned before. That is not what it's about. We have locally come up with what we call base camp op, just to make sure that misunderstanding is not part of it. But comment, if you will, on your view regarding what you said tonight, how the ends can be brought about in the way that you're talking about, as Lewis would have it, as Lewis did it, through partially pulling away and retrieving the faith if we need to, building the faith, passing the faith on, and then being able to effectively, as Lewis, as you pointed out, pass it on to the, quote, outsiders. Labrie was one example, a live-in sort of thing, but I'm talking about a more permanent kind of thing.
Yeah.
Please comment.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it because right, there's sort of the Benedict option discourse in a lot of kind of culturally conservative circles, and there's various projects out there, where people, there's one reading of the world out there that the big story is sort of the decline of the household. And maybe what we want to do is create projects over here, off in some part of land where kind of collections of households have a sort of older model. That's maybe not quite the way to say it, not the older model, but they want to instantiate those values, those kinds of old and in some ways good values in a more robust local communal setting. I can't as such say that's a problem. I mean, that might be a good thing. That might be a good project to have. I'm not certain, but it might be a good project to have. I don't want to judge it. What I want to say is I think the danger is that we think there is just one project. There is one general way to talk about the Christian project. But there are many different strategies. There's many different things to go do. So do you want to be Tim Keller? Or no, don't go be Tim Keller, because you're not. I'm not. But if if you think like, hey, I'd like to actually be present in my suburban community and love all these people around me and share the light of Christ with them, or I want to go work in this urban environment and do that, or I would like to actually have a Christian community in a more rural space or something like that. None of those are intrinsically wrong, and all of them could be motivated by hubristic or pathological things. And so to me, it's never quite the project itself. If the project's motivated by let's just sort of pull out of the suburban and urban spaces and let it all burn to the ground so that we can make our utopia from the ashes, I think that's pathological because your neighbors are all in the suburban and urban area and you don't want them to burn down. Hopefully they do better. And if you can do something about it, do something about it. Nevertheless, like I think we could think of ourselves as, there's one general over the whole thing. And a general in an army, when he's sending out those various platoons, they all go do different things. Like, they have different instinct, or they have different sets of gifts. And you send the SEAL team to do this and this platoon to go do that and this platoon. And they often, and I think this is crucial, they often don't really know what is going on with each other. In other words, they just know their job. They don't know the other people's job or why the general is having that. And it could be, and so one of the things I say out of that, maybe one implication of this, is I think we need to be cautious that we don't dismiss the instincts of other Christians in some of these areas. I think where we get into trouble is where we say, well, my instincts are they're just the only thing to do. This is the only project to have. Go make a household and homeschool your kids. That's the only way to be a godly Christian. No, it's not. That's just not true. And that's ridiculous. In fact, it's a good project, perhaps. There are other projects, though, and the king can dignify and make work together because civilization is a complex set of sinews through sort of common connections can make all that work together. And I think a lot of times we're just biting and devouring one another and talking about how our thing is better than your thing, when in fact we could say, hey, there are some goods that you're going to get out of doing things that way that you're not going to get out over here. But there are also some goods that we'll get out over here that you won't get by doing that project. And maybe God intends all of it. And maybe all of them would actually flourish more if we looked at one another that way or tried to relate to one another that way. So maybe, sort of the Doug Wilsons and the Tim Kellers of the world should look at each other and say, what are you doing that I could never do? And what are you doing that I could never do? And maybe it's all good. That doesn't mean you don't have anything to learn or modify in one another. But it's not a zero-sum game. Just as the marching orders of a battalion are not a zero-sum game, and they shouldn't be bickering with one another about you're not doing the right thing. Well, maybe they had a different project, that God had inspired in them through their gifts and whatnot. There's obviously room to criticize. Again, we can say like, hey, that motivation is kind of pathological, brother. But nevertheless, I think we need to be cautious and assume, and this is where what Lewis will do, I think. The motivation that leads you to take up that project is a motivation that could lead you to take up a like project that was for God's glory. In other words, I don't think we should look at these things and say, well, don't go do that. That's ridiculous. I think we should say, how can that be done in a way that's really glorifying to God and beneficial to others? And I think if we enter that headspace, maybe I'm too, idealist or utopian or something. But I think if we enter that headspace, I think the answers would surprise us. That's my guess.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barlow, for those two questions. Those are very, very good questions. We have one from our esteemed president, Brad.
Aha!
So Brad writes, the primary questions/conflicts that Lewis was addressing in his context were theological. Politics, while always a source of conflict, was not terribly polarized in the England of his day, and the fault lines did not align with theological issues. Today, however, we have to cope not merely with fault lines over faith, but with political polarization, and the two have been entangled. Does this make our challenge greater than Lewis's? And if so, what do we do about it?
I think the answer to the first question is yes. It does make our challenges more difficult in some ways. And what do we do about it? Well, we take on the mantle of our elder brother and move further into the project of mediating sagedom to civilization. I think Lewis's project is very radical, and I think the implications for us are very radical. And I'm not saying I have any particular wisdom about what the line is. You know, it might be that there are political in our day, just given the actual reality on the ground. You know, it might be that extreme political realignments and all sorts of things are necessary for the common good. I hope not. I hope the U.S. of A. will get itself together and preserve our great union. That's my personal hope. But maybe that won't happen. Nevertheless, I think. Nevertheless, I guess what I'm trying to say is yes, I think it is in some ways more complicated and more difficult. Though Lewis is living through World War II and such, but in England at least, yeah, maybe these things don't align as much as we would think. But about going further. You know, I was talking to somebody just a couple days ago, and he said something interesting. He was talking about the founding of the C.S. Lewis Institute in Washington, D.C. And one of the founders of the C.S. Lewis Institute, what he said was, I don't want to just create a big C.S. Lewis fan club. What I want to do is create an organization that helps make 10,000 more C.S. Lewises. And I think that's the program. Maybe that's the advertisement. Since Brad, my president, asked that question, maybe I can say, Brad, I should get a raise because I just advertised our program. You know, producing more C.S. Lewises. That should be our tagline. I think that's the goal, actually. I think that's got to be the way forward. At least that's a minimal part of the project. What actually happens with concrete, hard Machiavellian political realities out of that is something I can't prognosticate because I don't know. I do think, nevertheless, that Lewis Project is living and viable because, in part, I think it is just the Christian project within a human civilization. I think he's just a great exemplar of it in his own context.
Thank you for answering all of these questions. We have a few really good ones that we are not going to be able to get to because, unfortunately, we're all out of time. Thank you to everyone who came and who listened and who stayed until the end. I'm sure that it was worth it. I know that it was for me. So if you would like to support Joe's ministry, there is a link in the chat, which I have just posted, to our Kindful page. We have a little drop-down menu, and you can select Joe Minich and make sure that your donation goes to him. If you would like to hear more from Dr. Minich, I am also posting a link to the chat to our Davenant Hall page, where you can sign up for updates on courses that Dr. Minich will be teaching in the future. We would encourage all of you to, if you're not already doing so, to continue to support and to follow the work of the Davenant Institute and to become a regular listener of Dr. Minich's podcast, which is called A Pilgrim Faith, which he co-hosts with Dale Stenberg, one of our other teaching fellows. And we hope to see you at lectures like this in the future.
Thanks, everybody.